Hello, scholars, and welcome to week 4 discussion. So I wanted to just do a little bit of housekeeping. First, week 4, we're going over Anderson's The Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1935. And keep it in mind that we will be on Anderson for 3 weeks. So week 4, 5, and 6, we will be talking about Anderson. It's not lost on me that we are reading Anderson during Black History Month and all the things that are going on in our country in the United States. So I wanted us to really lean into that and know that reading this is important work that we're reading, but reading it in the time that we are and in this time and place is even more relevant and important. So in this video, we'll be talking about chapters 1 through 3 of Anderson. And so some themes that I saw is Anderson is tying these two concepts of citizenship as the United States has just gotten out of getting into Reconstruction, and how this ties citizenship education ties to public schooling or common schooling. So Anderson starts his book in 1860. Keeping in mind the Civil War was from 1861 to 1865, and Reconstruction era was 1865 to 1877. Now, from the start of that, you may see some people that include the Civil War and Reconstruction, but for the purpose of this video and how I think about it, I don't put the Civil War in these conversations when we're thinking about schooling, and that's just my preference. But you will see that some people put those together. Anderson is beginning his book with the time frame that is defined by the denied citizenship and right to vote for Black community members, and this control for labor power that's going on in the South, and as we'll learn about, that the Northerners want to be involved with as well. Within this historical narrative, Anderson is sharing with us the larger social, economic, and political context that is happening in the Southern United States at this time. He's also sharing with us that the mission of education for the Black community was to defend and extend their emancipation. That is their purpose of education. So he continues this conversation, or begins this conversation in chapter 1. We're starting to see that the Black community, once slaves, are struggling to build schools, but they also have this deep desire to develop and maintain and continue to control the effort. And we see this dedication and resiliency in that. Yet, on the other side of things, or also trying to control and maintain and develop schools, are white philanthropists that Anderson is talking about, and missionaries, who have this strong savior complex as they head down south to help develop schools for the Black community. And they bring with them these values and rules of what it means to have civil society, which Anderson does a great job really explaining for us and giving those receipts. So again, in chapter 1, Anderson is sharing with us that the Black community built these educational spaces even before the saviors from the North started to come down and descend on them. Anderson discusses the relationships with the churches and the Sunday schools, and even how that has developed into, if you're coming from a Christian background, you know about Sunday school. So we see that this history of what we now know as Sunday school is steeped in this history of Black education. And that, as Anderson is telling us, is that there was time and educational space spent on these Sundays to educate and to have school in these churches. So as Anderson discusses, this self-determination of the Black community has escaped historians and is usually written from the white philanthropic and missionaries' point of view, and Anderson is disrupting that in his book. Anderson continues to remind us that education was not a post-emancipation idea, that education and self-improvement and learning about the world has always been important to the Black community. So Anderson on the top of page 18 discusses how planters are describing education and that a literate culture would contradict the status of Black Southerners. So again, Anderson is getting to this ideology of how white planters, but then we'll also see later on how Northern philanthropists were thinking about what Black education would do for Black individuals. Understanding that it was very different from what Anderson has told us that the mission for Black schools was for the Black community, which again was to expand emancipation. And also keeping in mind, Anderson tells us that Black education meant universal education for all. The Black community understood that if they had education, it would be important for everyone to have education. It wasn't an exclusive idea. And we see this also in womanist and Black feminist thought. Bell Hooks specifically, assigned her book for a class last semester, talks about when Black women specifically are liberated, it's liberation for all. And we're seeing this in Anderson as he talks about Black education and what the Black community wanted for Black education. And I think it's just indicative of the spirit of the Black community. It's never an exclusive idea. It's liberation for everyone. It's saying, hey, we want this and we want everyone to have this. So at this time, Anderson discusses that the biggest opposition came from the white lower classes. And I'm going to read this quote on page 23. It's at the end of the first paragraph. The planters, with few exceptions, viewed Black education as a distinct threat to the racially qualified form of labor exploitation upon which their agrarian, I think I'm saying that right, order depended. And then if you have the book, there's also a graphic on page 24 that shows a graphic that was circulated essentially saying that this is why we don't need Black individuals having education. And so this conversation mirrors what we're seeing, the slow development of schools and economic development for the Black community in the South. And we see that, again, it's mirrored in this educational process, what we're seeing politically, socially, and economically within the South. And Anderson's receipts that he shows in chapter 1 is laying out for us how this was systemic and systematic in the disenfranchisement of Black education from white Southerners, and as we'll learn later, white Northerners as well. Now I'm going to move to chapter 2, and let's talk about Booker T and Samuel Armstrong. And I'll talk more about Armstrong because I think within the Black community, there's still a conversation that takes place in this Booker T versus W.E.B. Du Bois conversation and ways of doing education. So I'm going to focus more on Armstrong because I think we have a lot to say about Mr. Armstrong and his philosophy and way of thinking about industrial education for Black schools. Now you'll see me looking down at my notes, and I always make notes for our videos, but Anderson packs in a lot of receipts and a lot of information into his book, so I just want to make sure that I'm getting as much as I can in our videos together. So Anderson, keep in mind, is not coming for the legacy of these schools, the Tuskegees and the Hamptons. What Anderson is doing is sharing the historical and philosophical lens of those leading these schools and how those leading these schools, the white individuals, for example, Armstrong, when we talk about Hampton and Tuskegee, these ideologies that Black individuals need to stay in this second-class citizenship and the labor exploitation agenda of these schools and the curriculum within this historical context or this historical time that Anderson is sharing. So before moving more deeply into chapter 2, I want to touch on this historiography move that Anderson makes in his writing. So if you remember, historiography is how we're writing about history. And I wanted to point out this move that Anderson and a lot of historians do in that they're zooming in and they're zooming out. And what I mean by that is that Anderson does this zoom in, what I call zoom in a lot. So he is talking about this concept, and then he zooms into this example. So where this comes into play in chapter 2 is how in depth, or how he zooms in to Hampton and what is going on in Hampton, in the curriculum and the development and the leadership of Hampton. So before that, he's talking about industrial education as a concept, and then he zooms in to talk more about Hampton. And we see that quite a bit in his book, because he will go in. He goes very deep with those receipts when he starts zooming in. So I just wanted to point that out because I love that he does that, and just want to share how I describe that way of writing history. So within this zooming in of Armstrong and the Hampton model that we see, Anderson starts talking about Armstrong, and Armstrong, for him, Reconstruction in the United States is the removal of black people from politics. For Armstrong, that's the true idea of Reconstruction. And the pages I'm looking at right now are in between page 37 and 39, where he's specifically talking about Armstrong. And so Armstrong thinks, for him, that the black community is not capable of self-governance. And I really want us to think about that. This idea that Armstrong thinks moral development is more important than mental development. And this idea that Armstrong does not believe that the black community has developed, is morally developed. And of course I chuckle at this because Armstrong sees himself as morally superior based on his Eurocentric epistemology of what he understands morality to be, and we talked about that in our last video. He also touches on this and includes religion into this conversation later on page 53, in how religion is boosting this political career that pastors are having. So he takes a stab at religion. But my biggest question is, does the evidence that Anderson gives us and shares illuminate a moral high ground for Armstrong to stand on? And you all know my answer. Of course it does not. So this week, and maybe even all throughout Anderson, you will see me or hear me give you a lot of quotes from the books. And I do that because when I think about the ideology that Southerners, Armstrong specifically we're talking about right now, and Northern philanthropists have, we see that in the writing that Armstrong is doing. So I want to continue to hear from Armstrong on how he is supporting my claims and I'm giving you that evidence of this ideology that white folks in the South and the North have when it comes to the black community, and how they're navigating their thoughts and ideas as they want to control black education. So on page 42, Anderson says industrial education. So Armstrong wants to use industrial education to socialize blacks to understand and accept their disenfranchisement and to make them more productive laborers. So that's why he is wanting to use industrial, or that is what he wants to use industrial education for. Anderson goes on to talk about how Armstrong is using this on page 44 and 45 in how he is shaping the role of teachers, the economy, political and social consciousness of the black masses. So that is what Armstrong is trying to do with industrial education, and what Anderson is laying out for us. Armstrong is wanting to control what the black teachers would teach and how they would teach. That word we said in the first week, pedagogy. So wanting to control that. And also the structure of the school, Armstrong is wanting to control as well. And Anderson discusses Armstrong thinking that black students needed a boarding school so that the teachers could, quote, control the entire 24 hours of each day. And that quote is on page 46. So this book, along with any that are looking at true history, is always hard because I have to stop and I have to process what is going on. I have to process my rage. I have to process my anger and my sadness in the history of what we know as the United States. And on page 51, this is an example of that. So Anderson talks about Armstrong and how Armstrong is wanting to teach black students that oppression was not the cause of their second-class citizenship or their position, but the natural process of cultural evolution. So that is what Armstrong is wanting to put in the minds of the students that are attending these schools. And remember, the schools, it's younger kids, 5, 6 years old, all the way up to adults that are attending these schools, because at this point, there hasn't been any schools for black individuals. So these are the things that Armstrong is wanting to be the ideology and the core kind of philosophy of black education. Anderson shares with us that students and the black community are not accepting this as the only form of education, and this meaning industrial education. And we see that in the disrespect of the black alumni and visitors and the black trustees as they're coming to Hampton. Anderson shares how the white individuals who weren't being listened to, how they infiltrated Southern black education to control it and have surveillance. And so we see in this chapter, Armstrong, as he talks about multiple times, is trying to work out, and you see my air quotes, the race problem. And his Hampton model was not only an educational theory, but a social philosophy, as Anderson says. And these educational theories and social philosophies were funded by the families we are aware of today. So we see a lot of names dropped that I'm sure that are familiar in those that were funding this industrial education agenda. So Anderson concludes chapter 2 with reminding us that the normal school under this Hampton model was a facade, because the mission was not teacher education, but I'm reading from the top of 77, page 77. Anderson says these schools were to train a core of teachers with a particular social philosophy relevant to the political and economic reconstruction of the South. Again, the mission, this reconstruction, in the words of what Armstrong saw as what reconstruction needed to be in the South. So we're moving on to chapter 3. And the first thing I wanted to say is that within this chapter, Anderson is showing us that the savior complex was so strong for the Northern philanthropists that they thought they could form an alliance with Southern conservatives, believing that universal education made better citizens and would provide social stability and economic prosperity. That's what they wanted to align themselves with Southern conservatives to do. Now, to do this, Anderson talks a lot about these conferences that are had to discuss black education and they modeled these conferences after Lake Mohawk conferences, which you all will read about in our next book, because these conferences that they were having in Anderson books were to talk about what they deemed the black problem, and what they modeled these after, the Lake Mohawk conferences, those that we'll read about in our next book, were to tackle the Indian problem. So I just want to give some of that context, and you'll see that again as we read our next book. So again, we're seeing in chapter 3 how Northern philanthropists wanted to align themselves with Southern conservatives, again, because they believe universal education for the black community made better citizens, provided social stability, and economic prosperity. So within these conferences that they had, they were also demonstrating that white folks needed to be the leaders, and that they must educate everyone so that United States society would not be dragged down. And that's language that Anderson provides in his receipts, all of his historical archiving. He provides that language for us in this chapter and throughout the book. So on page 89, I'm going to read a quote from philanthropist George Peabody. So one thing I want you all to do after you watch this video is I want you to go search George Peabody and see the company that he co-founded. So this is the co-founder of that company saying that he wanted to convince his Southern countrymen that the Hampton Tuskegee program could help build a strong Southern economy on the backs of submissive, non-political, cheap black labor. And I should say that is the words of Anderson. That's how Anderson is interpreting that. But we see within the chapter how George Peabody has continuously made this his mission in this chapter. And in this chapter, Anderson continues to share how this belief of and promotion of the disenfranchisement of black individuals or black community members, and doing that through education in this case. But Southerners were still scared that education would make the black community have more political and economic roles in Southern society. And as Anderson points out on page 96, for white Southerners, for them, universal education equaled universal suffrage. So that was the mindset that they had when it came to universal education. And remember, I talked about universal education for the black community meant that education would be for everyone. But white Southerners were focused on black education, meaning that it would be suffrage, black suffrage for everyone, meaning that black individuals would continue to live into that emancipation and continue to be liberated. And they weren't on board with that. And I would say some are still not. So Anderson continues to share with us how the Northern philanthropists didn't understand how the Southerners couldn't see that universal education as a win for them. And on page 97, he discusses the philanthropists were disillusioned by the South's failure to comprehend the social and economic advantages of industrial trained labor, and didn't understand why Southerners wouldn't take this time for even more control and how they would shape black schools and education. And as Anderson discusses, their enlightened self-interest is what the Northerners called their involvement in school. But as Anderson notes on page 98, the Southerners knew exactly what they were doing. And since the Northern philanthropists could not get the things to work out in their favor, as we see Anderson discusses on page 109, they turned their funds and attention to create alternative industrial normal or teacher schools and county schools to train teachers for rural schools. And as Anderson points out on page 109, the philanthropists drew upon their great wealth and political connection to build the institutions that corresponded to their economic, political, and social interests. As I've already stated, Anderson packs a lot into his books, and I hope I have done it justice these first 3 chapters. So let me know your questions. Make sure you like and share and comment, and that helps my channel grow and reach more people. Thank you. I'll see you next time.